BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Trevor Jackson, an economic historian at Berkeley University and the author of Impunity and Capitalism. Let me get this right, the afterlife of financial crises. And Trevor, welcome to the BlomCast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Now, tell me one thing before we delve in, and we've got so much to delve into, from the enclosure of the Commons to tomorrow, basically. But tell me, what is it like at the moment to be working at an American university? This is the 16th of April that we're recording this, so tell me about it.
Well, it is a stressful and uncertain time. We don't know from day to day what's going to happen, and for that reason, I think many of us, both faculty and administration, are reluctant to communicate things that we think we know because we fear being wrong and telling people the wrong information, which in turn has a compounding effect of further making us feel uncertain. And so in that sense, it's very difficult to know whether this moment of crisis and threat is soon going to end. There is some possibility that Harvard standing up to the administration's demands might be a tipping point. The other elite universities might follow. Harvard is usually a real innovator in determining what elite self-interest looks like, and once they go, many others are likely to follow. Being at Berkeley means, on the one hand, perhaps we're better insulated because we are a public university. We are, in some ways, funded by or directed by state-level government. The UC system is in the Constitution of the state of California, so we are going to continue to exist. On the other hand, we obviously are specifically a target, and we know that we are on a list of universities to be investigated by the Department of Justice, and that hasn't happened to us yet, but it's unclear what the consequences may be.
Has that ever happened in the history of the university before?
It has. In fact, a more refined version of this is actually a relatively common thing, in that the administration is using, perverting anti-discrimination law as a weapon. Well, so many universities, sometimes rightly, have been sued for committing discrimination. And in the past, what that has meant is when that happens, whatever part of the university is investigated and perhaps found responsible might lose federal funding, but that in the past has not meant any other part of the university is affected. So if the men's volleyball team is found guilty of something, that doesn't necessarily in the past take away money from molecular and cell biology. So on the one hand, there is something extremely precedented about this, but on the other hand, the scale and magnitude and extra legality or illegality of it is entirely new. And I think for that reason, universities are very used to responding through legal channels, and it's unclear whether those channels work the way that we're accustomed to them working. Much of what the Trump administration has done seems to be illegal.
But there's so much of it that the courts will take a long time to wind their way towards it, which one would have to think is strategy, is tactic, to overwhelm the legal system by just creating facts on a massive scale.
Yes, and we know that at the end of the chain of responsibility is a Supreme Court that is very friendly to the Trump administration, and many of them were appointed by Trump the first time around, and so it's hard to feel confident that these cases will wind their way through the courts and then receive a fair hearing at the Supreme Court. But a lot of what has happened has been so blatantly, clearly not legal that it's hard to believe even a very motivated court will uphold all of it. But it's very hard to know. Probably some of it will survive, some of it won't.
I mean, so much has happened that was hard to believe 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago.
Yes. I think we at Berkeley, we have not yet felt the brunt of it. But somewhere like University of California, San Francisco faces an existential threat. They have no undergraduate students. They're a pure science research university. They have a medical school. They do incredibly important, high-quality scientific research that depends entirely on federal funding. And so if that goes away, they may not survive in a way that we might.
Tell me something as a naive observer from abroad. Now, I can fully understand why a Trump administration would go after the humanities, because there's a culture war going on. They're blaming them for introducing what they call cultural Marxism into the brains of innocent children, etc. And there may even be some merit to that critique, but anyway, we see where that enmity comes from. But the sciences? I mean, isn't this how America is the technological front runner, the great innovator, the market leader that it is? Isn't that just shooting yourself in both knees?
Well, there are two interpretations of this, both of which are absurd in different ways. One interpretation is that this regime is ideologically committed to the idea that private markets, private industry should do everything. And so they believe that whatever research and development is happening should be done by, entirely by private companies.
Which is interesting because so far it was especially state-funded research into low-yield fields that eventually generated stuff like the internet and other little details, and had then its profits privatized and not returned to the state system. But it was the state that actually germinated all these technologies when they were not yet lucrative.
None of this makes sense. I think that explanation also doesn't match the magnitude of this assault, in the sense that surely those private companies who hire engineers who went to colleges, right, and got degrees at them. The colleges must exist to train the engineers who are going to work at Tesla.
Perhaps they just pray for success?
I don't know. I don't understand this plan. The other explanation, which is a bit more sinister and I think for that reason more plausible, is that by threatening sciences with their continued existence, that actually, at least what we saw at Columbia, is that did not produce solidarity amongst the faculty. What happened instead is the administrators said, we can't let the sciences be wiped out. So to save them, we need to make sacrifices elsewhere. And so we will comply with the administration's demands because we can't let the sciences lose all of their funding. And so they recognized that actually the power of sciences was the thing to attack, because that meant everyone else will bend over backwards to make sure that they survive. That's a possibility. But it also, it's also clear that some of the federal cuts and the cuts to federal funding are happening in ways that are just, frankly, stupid and counterproductive. And so, maybe this is something we can actually speak about more broadly, that I think one interpretation of this administration is that they are, for the first time, a really regime change assault on all of the principles of post-war American hegemony. That from the dollar as the international reserve currency to the full faith and credit of the U.S. government to the research university to all of these things.
Little transatlantic partnership.
Precisely, right. All these things that built almost a century of American global foreign policy and power around the world, they are dismantling. And it's unclear to me if that is a project that has a replacement or if it's just a purely destructive one. Many of these people are venture capital people or distressed debt people. They are used to dismantling large-scale organizations.
They profit from volatility as well.
Yeah, and so maybe that just is the only way that they can think, and they're approaching the U.S. government as though It's a giant corporation that they have bought in bankruptcy and are dismantling.
This gets us to the heart of your research. You are that very old-fashioned thing, a historian of capitalism. Now, usually I have a mild mental eye roll when I meet historians of capitalism, but your work is really fascinating. And it describes the basic dynamism of capitalist markets and what their tendencies are and how they are in relation to democracies in the end. But you start much earlier, you start in the 17th century, and this is a well-worn story, but a terribly important one. Since Polanyi, but the enclosure of the commons is really a sort of exemplaric story for so much of what happened in later centuries. You connect that with emerging capitalist markets and also with their volatility. Can you just give us a little hint of that? A little sense of your argument?
Well, I can try. And I think maybe I will preface that by taking the opportunity that you've given me to try to draw a distinction between what I think I'm trying to do and what the new history of capitalism has been doing, which is to say that's a field in American academia that has emerged since the 2008 crisis and has become quite powerful. It has a strong base at Harvard. There are many academics now who have gotten jobs and are now well into their careers who would call themselves historians of capitalism. And they are mainly interested in the history of slavery and labor in the 19th century U.S. And so they tend to view the slave South as the classic capitalist society. And many of them are quite explicit about their goal being to force a moral and political reckoning with the legacies of American slavery and racism. And so to my mind, they are less interested in capitalism per se, and more interested in the legacies of slavery and racism. I was trained not in that tradition. I was trained in an older, economist-dominated, empiricist, economic history world. But that's one that doesn't use the concept of capitalism at all. Those are people who tend to think that everyone is rational, everybody's maximizing, everybody's calculating, that that's always and everywhere true. And so capitalism has no meaning as a social system. There are just people that face constraints and institutions, and they maximize what they can. And so what I was trying to do with the first book was, on the one hand, to try to inject some empiricist, particularly financial research into the more politically inflected new history of capitalism. I wanted to talk to them. And on the other side, I wanted to try to persuade my more economist colleagues and interlocutors that capitalism is a meaningful historical phenomenon that we can try to study, and that has changed over time. And so it seemed to me that crises are a good moment to focus on, because a crisis has a tendency to concentrate the mind, and it has a tendency to leave a lot of records in the archive.
Just because in the public conversation so often capitalism, like fascism, is something that you throw around when you talk about something you think you know what you mean, or neoliberalism is another nice one. Can you give us for this conversation a working definition of capitalism, what you mean when you use that word?
Absolutely. And this is important exactly because the new history of capitalism as a group has explicitly refused to define what they mean. They say deliberately as a methodological choice that they do not want to define capitalism. I think it's very important to define the object of our study. So to me, and this is a bit of a schematic version of this, but to me, capitalism is an economic system that is predicated on markets and the factors of production, meaning land, labor, and capital. And so I think it's not so much about commodity markets. Can you buy a loaf of bread? I think we can find commodity markets in ancient Rome. I think we can find commodity markets in the Soviet Union, all sorts of places. But can you buy the things that make things? Can you buy labor in a market? Can you buy land in a market? Can you buy capital in a market? And those are historical questions, all right? And so we can kind of think of a spectrum by which we become, say, more capitalist, the more of those factor markets exist, and less, if less so. Those markets, of course, depend on a whole set of legal institutions about property and contracts and the state and taxation and all sorts of other things.
Which, by the way, people often seem to forget when they talk about free markets, as if they existed away from those institutions that make them possible.
Right. And so, I mean, you rightly invoke Polanyi, who has been somebody that has been very useful in speaking across fields and disciplines. And so he is somebody that people in economics or political economy are familiar with, and so is a way of providing a common language for a historian like myself who tends to think there is no such thing as a pre-social or pre-state market in the state of nature that then the state and society, intervenes into. It's just sort of a category error that markets are fundamentally produced by and structured by states and society. But that they follow different imperatives, different moralities, different sets of institutions, hence Polanyi's entire point about the possibility of markets seeming to become unembedded or disembedded in their wider societies. And so that very much is what the book is about. It's about the ways that the economic sphere, particularly encapsulated in finance, because it's international, because it's hard to understand, that emerges and becomes disembedded from the wider society that it's present in, which produces a whole set of anxieties and concerns among political theorists. And in doing so, one constitutive element of that sphere is that it defines away a series of harms and obligations, such that, and this is sort of the punchline of the book, such that what defines the economic sphere, as opposed to the political or the legal or the social, is that within the economy, great harm can and will happen to many, many people, but nobody will be at fault. If you lose your job because you lose your job, that's not a crime. If your boss fires you, that might be a greater hardship than if your boss were to break into your house and steal your television. One of those is a crime, the other is not. And so why? Historically, why is that the case? And so the book tries to tell the story from an institution known as the Chambre de Justice, which was a common phenomenon in early modern France, in which in a crisis the entire financial community would be put on trial, the assumption being that they must have done something bad. Every crisis was assumed to be a crime and a conspiracy. Well, okay, so there we are at the end of the 17th, early 18th century. By 1825, there's an international financial crisis, and not only is nobody prosecuted for it, but it never even occurs to anyone that they should be. It's discussed in public as though it's a storm. So how does a financial crisis go from being a crime to being a natural disaster? That's the question of the book.
Well, it's a question that's very topical. When you look at 2008, I was listening to an interview with Rahm Emanuel, where he said something that I really would like to engage about with you, because he basically said, look, we have to look at the fact that there's elite failure here. After the Second Iraq War, which was started on false pretenses, nobody was held responsible, but hundreds of thousands of people died. After the financial crisis, nobody was held responsible, though millions of people lost their homes. And he said, this idea of elite impunity is poison for democracy. So what about this? So how does an economic crisis become change from a crime to a natural disaster?
Well, I don't often find myself agreeing with Rahm Emanuel, but I think he's right about, and I think the way that I would narrate the last 25 years of American, or perhaps even international, political economy, very much including the current Trump administration, is that it's been a giant crisis of political legitimacy that has resulted from the performance of elite impunity. And so we can no doubt come back and talk more about that. In the story of the book, I move through three moments of financial crisis. Beginning, there's a sort of prelude in 1709, but especially the crises around the South Sea and Mississippi bubble in 1720, And then there's a rupture with the French Revolution that produces international financial disorder, and then the Panic of 1825. And the story is sort of not so much a succession or a diffusion of forms of impunity as a kind of addition or sedimentation of new ones. The old never quite go away. There's some ways that impunity is a feature of sovereignty, and sovereigns are very difficult to be held accountable to anything. And that was true for Louis XIV. That's true for Donald Trump. That's a problem that, I can't say that a regime ended and that problem got solved and we moved on. Not at all. It remains. What we get are new forms. And so the first crisis is about what you might say a move from the personal to the corporate, away from an individual who on a case-by-case ad hoc basis might be the recipient of some form of impunity. In 1709, Samuel Bernard, the richest man in Europe, goes bankrupt, and he receives personal protection from prosecution by his creditors. He is the personal lender to the king. He is too big to fail, and so he specifically gets protected from prosecution. Well, so that's a very individualized form of impunity. By the 1720 crisis, well, we have joint stock companies. There's a separation between ownership and management. It's unclear who is directly responsible, who made what decisions, what did they know. In the case of the South Sea bubble in Britain, nothing like it had happened before, and so Parliament has to invent new laws to retroactively prosecute the directors of the South Sea Company for a scheme that Parliament itself had authorized. In the case of France, it's a political move against an attempt to set up a central bank and monetary policy. There again, nothing had happened before. So there's a problem of precedent, there's a problem of scale, there's a problem of who specifically is accountable. In the French Revolution, these questions get politicized. Rather than being a technical question about who is responsible for decision-making in a corporation, well, they get interpreted as large-scale political conspiracies. And the struggle to govern finance becomes a political struggle about the sovereignty of the people over the market. And so there's a violent, sometimes struggle over this throughout the French Revolution that eventually gets consolidated in a new set of institutions that have separated the political from the economic. And so in a post-revolutionary 19th century context, markets do what markets do. They sometimes have crises. These are interpreted as inevitable, nobody's fault in particular, because fault is a political concept. Whereas we have a different set of economic and legal concepts to think about bankruptcy or fiduciary responsibility or monetary policy and so on. So that's essentially the narrative of the book.
Well, that narrative is still going on very much.
Well, so the main the main critique that the book has gotten is that it ends too soon.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Was that the safety of distance that historical distance gives you?
Well, the case that I wanted to make was that 1825 is the first of then many crises that have a similar structure throughout the 19th century. And so I thought it would be redundant to then tell the story of the Panic of 1837 and 1857 and 1866 and 1873 and 1893. I'm not going to do that.
1873 was terribly important in Vienna.
Absolutely. And inaugurates a 20-year global deflation. I think that's among the more interesting financial crises that people should know about. 1907 is another good parallel to 2008. So, I thought, well, gosh, I can tell the story of the first of many, and that sets like a set of parameters. The real question then was I going to address the Great Depression? And I thought, well, that is such a big story that's potentially a book on its own. So I thought, well, look, it's true that I would like to keep this going. Many reviewers accurately diagnosed that in some ways this is a book that's just because I'm still angry about the Bush administration. That's true.
You've got other things to focus your anger on now.
Right. Imagine being so angry that you are compelled to write a book about 18th century finance.
That's a particular kind of anger, I must say. But I want to come back to this idea of impunity, and because look, I mean, I've just listened to a Russian journalist, I've talked about this before on this podcast, who said, look, what they're saying in Moscow is what's happening in the West now is what's happened to us in 1989. This is more than the end of a transatlantic partnership. This is the end of an ideological construct, a world to live in, a system of coordinates that was called the West. And, you know, there is some merit to this idea that perhaps they're codependent twins that kept each other sharp, and when one collapsed, the other declared historic victory. But victory, as we all know, winning makes you stupid, and victories tend to make you blind, certainly selectively blind. And it seems that something happened in these societies, in these victorious liberal societies, something, and here's really my question to a professional economic historian and not a layman like me. This also describes the great push of globalization, also of financial globalization, the mobility of capital, a deindustrialization of what's called the West, which also means, I mean, on the one hand, people have a lot more cheap stuff to buy because stuff gets cheaper. But on the other hand, those very people lose their political bargaining position. So whereas, for instance, in Europe you had a decent balance between workers and bosses because the bosses needed the workers and the workers could strike, that is no longer possible. It seems to me that this development goes on. It moves to oil, and with that to a more globalized economy also, because oil is a lot more easy to produce. It needs fewer people. It's more easily transportable. But there's a political balance disturbed in these formerly industrial societies. And there is an elite that is no longer held to account because there is no longer a powerful counterweight. And this elite discovers for itself the coincidence of being right. And really has a gigantic flowering that also goes along with a liberal approach to society, a liberal approach to ethics, which then again many people resent because perhaps they didn't get taken along on the way. It's not their world that has changed that much in these respects, but it is the world of this elite, and it's taught at the universities, and they are presented with a world they no longer understand. Do you think there is some merit in this image of an elite cut loose from political accountability?
I do. And I think I would answer that in terms of two books that I would recommend to all of your listeners. And the first is a book called The Triumph of Broken Promises that was out, I think, last year by a historian called Fritz Bartel, who teaches at a university in Texas. And it's a book that's about the very vexed concept of neoliberalism. But the story that he wants to tell is that both the Soviet Union and the United States faced an energy crisis in the 1970s and a stagflationary crisis. And that the American elite figured out a way to break its promises about growth, social mobility, the possibility of an abundant future, and to at least defer the consequences of legitimacy to themselves. And that the Soviet elite was not able to break its promises. Once it was not able to deliver what it claimed communism was going to deliver, the regime collapsed. And so I think something about a framing of Western elites learning to break their promises and learning how to evade consequences, political consequences for that, and kind of buying time as that process compounds itself until ultimately, after 2008, we see these incredible moments where, long-standing political parties are just annihilated at the polls and replaced by entirely new parties. In a moment where, either it's Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, either it's Nigel Farage or it's Jeremy Corbyn, right? Cases where, Belgium goes 589 days without a government.
And nobody noticed, basically.
Well, and if anything, they did economically better than other places because they didn't have a government to enforce ruthless austerity. It was better to be governed by no one. So, I take that as symptomatic of a long-standing, simmering crisis of the legitimacy of the political system as such. And so I think that book is a kind of useful way of thinking of the lineages. And the other, which came out, I think, yesterday, is Quinn Slobodian's new book.
He will be on here soon.
Oh, great. Well, tell him I said hello. He's been, I think, one of the great historians of putting some meaning onto the concept of neoliberalism. And his prior book, Globalists, was a story about neoliberalism being a reaction to decolonization and democratization. How do we preserve property and inequality in a world of democratization and decolonization? And his new book is sort of pushing that question forward and asking what happens to a conservative elite when it loses its, somewhat imagined, but loses its rival, the thing that it fears, the thing that gives it meaning. And in his view, and he'll elaborate on this better than me, but I think there's a truth to this, that in his view, the kind of strange, permutations or mutations perhaps of something like the Trump-Musk right wing seem like the morbid symptoms of an elite that has now, for such a long time, lost its idea of what its enemy is. And so it's sort of invented imaginary ones of decreasing coherence over time. And that might be a useful way of drawing a distinction between, say, the Bush administration, who thought we've won the Cold War, and so we will create an unchallenged American hegemony that will last 100 years, on very much the old terms of what Cold War visions of hegemony looked like. That's one project of what to do after the fall of the rival. The Trump-Musk right wing seems very different to that, and they seem like not an attempt to create that older vision of hegemony, but a kind of set of their own, apocalyptic, nightmarish imaginations, their own kind of weird death drive.
It's, I think, a beautiful new South Africa.
Right, a global South Africa.
A global South Africa, which is probably no longer a fight of the whites against the blacks, but a fight of the rich against the poor. But let me try out a rather wild idea on you that I had this morning, because I really don't know what to think of it yet. It seems that forms of the economy go ahead with obviously key technologies, but also systems of government. There is a connection that you can make between fossil fuels and their use, and the use, obviously, of steam engines and combustion engines and industrial production, and indeed with democracy, because you need a kind of balance in this kind of society and you need a lot of workers. You can say that feudalism, basically capitalism needed the concentration of productivity and capital on people that fossil fuels allowed to be created. And before that, capitalism wasn't really viable. Now, what happens now? When the key technology has changed, it's no longer any kind of engine, it's digital. And the energy source probably has changed as well, because hooray, it'll be renewables, but they are much less dependent on borders, they are much less dependent on state infrastructure, they can be very efficiently privatized. What system of government is the equivalent or is suitable for that kind of system of production and the economy? Is that finally what Yanis Varoufakis would call technofudalism?
I am skeptical of the techno-feudalist vision of the future, in part because I guess I'm doubtful that there is that much coherence to what at least the American elite is doing. I don't know that I would credit them with so much understanding of how political economy systems work. Much of what they're doing is at cross purposes. They themselves are sort of fractured set of interest groups. But there is a variant of that argument that I do worry about and find very plausible, which is that I think perhaps since the end of the Cold War, perhaps as a permutation of this thing we might call neoliberalism, that at least in the West, or perhaps writ large, that there's been a kind of collapse in our familiarity with, practice with, skills at the capacity to perform large-scale collective action that, I think might be a somewhat cultural change if we take a culturalist view of what neoliberalism is, and a shift from any sense of the public to a sense of the private, and everything is about individualized maximization. Or it could just be an institutional change, the decline of unions, the decline of forms of associational life. It could be this performance of elite impunity, regardless of democratic accountability. It could be all of these things. But I think that there are ways that it just feels like we have lost a sense that sustained intentional collective action can achieve intelligible goals.
It's not just a feeling. There's a whole pile of statistics that back that up, that show you how clubs are atrophying, and associations and social groups, and that people are basically spending more times on their mobile phones and less times in groups.
Precisely, right. And so there's a way that seems to me to be corrosive of any kind of large-scale project, and especially, I think, is creating a kind of, like a vacuum or a gap in our politics, given that we all clearly need to figure out how to do collective action in the face of climate change. It's like a classic large-scale collective action problem that we are least equipped to be able to solve. And so that then, creates this weird set of things that fill that gap. And so I guess I'm skeptical of the technofeudalism story, I think, because partly as an early modern historian, I think of feudalism as actually quite a communal thing, that very much rooted in localities and communities and tradition and custom and so on.
I think you've got a much richer idea of feudalism than Yanis Varoufakis obviously has.
But he probably understands technology better than I do. So.
But I mean, quite seriously, there is a new class of super rich people who do not have to obey the same laws of others, who don't pay the same taxes as others do, who can interfere into the elections of other countries, as Mr. Musk did directly in the German elections. That is new. These structures go across and up, they manage to avoid any kind of democratic answer to this phenomenon. Democracies are not equipped to deal with this phenomenon. And it seems to me that in itself is, I can understand, I sympathize with the historical argument about the richness of the feudalist world, but there's a kind of feudalism growing here.
But I think when I listen to our sinister tech oligarchs, what I hear them describing when they describe what they want, it sounds something more like a 19th century company town, or like apartheid South Africa, right? It sounds like a system of, obviously without a democracy component to it, but one in which, it isn't even so much the company anymore as a set of patrimonial, rich families that govern through some set of corporatized institutions, subject populations.
I'll take patrimonial rich families.
That in part, I should say, is the argument of Melinda Cooper's new book, Counter-Revolution, which is very good on this. And so, there are ways that those visions of the company town future sound to me to be just extremely capitalist. They don't sound very feudalist at all. They sound like the dreams of, robber barons from the 19th century. And so in that sense, it seems to me maybe what this is just the final victory or a final victory of capitalism over democracy, and that we don't need to reach for, feudalism.
No, I think the argument he would also make, and I think that's also an interesting part of the argument, is the effective end of free markets or any kind of free markets, that they're totally captive markets now, which is indeed something, again, that reminds you a bit more of the corporate structure of a medieval town than of a capitalist market.
Well, that's true, but also a capitalist firm itself is a structure for avoiding markets, right? Everything within a firm could be outside of the firm and contracted through markets. And so the construction of something, especially in a 19th century sense of the large, the trusts, the vertically integrated, horizontally integrated, 19th century Carnegie Steel, JP Morgan and so on, those were all decisions to eat markets and bring them all within the control structure of the firm. And so I think extending that to civil society is essentially the plan, that there is nothing outside the firm. And the firm, as we know, firms are run not as democracies, but as little dictatorships. And I think that's more of the world that Musk and Peter Thiel and those sorts of figures seem to want to achieve.
You have written very eloquently in the New York Review of Books about the coexistence, the rather troubled coexistence between democracy and capitalism. And I find that very interesting because it always strikes me that, no corporation, no firm is obliged to have the same interests as a state. A firm legitimately has a different state, namely to maximize financial profit. A state doesn't have that interest. Its profit lies somewhere else, which means that capitalist markets and the societies that shelter them effectively have diverging interests, and there needs to be a great effort of mediation between those two. That's one might call politics.
Right. Or returns us back to Polanyi, who would say exactly that these things can be in contradiction with each other, but ultimately firms and the market need to be embedded in the societies that make them possible. And that it's when they become disembedded, both culturally in the sense that they no longer view themselves as having any obligations or connection to their host societies, and in an economic and legal sense, that they become destructive of the conditions of their own possibility. And I think we're seeing a variant of that now. And I also think that this problem has been compounded by something I think we've already referred to a couple of times, which is a sense, perhaps from the Cold War, perhaps even earlier, that at least in the U.S., and I might generalize across the former, the capitalist West, that we've arrived at a sort of politics of managerial liberalism that has tried to avoid recognizing that there are ongoing distributive conflicts, and that there are zero-sum conflicts around inequality that these firms and markets are very much a part of. And instead, we have banked on avoiding those distributive conflicts through growth, education, technology, what have you, but that those conflicts never went away. And so we now find ourselves ill-equipped, at least on the side of the re-embedding side, you might say, ill-equipped to fight out those conflicts now that they are impossible to avoid or impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what I mean by my earlier point about collective action, is that these decades of politics of avoiding the recognition of distributive conflict has meant that there is no practice or set of institutions to fight the re-embedding fight. Whereas the other side has gotten only the more powerful, the only richer, the only better coordinated. But in a strange way, they're now sort of sawing off the branch that they're standing on. And so I think, we saw that with the tariff tantrum a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, but the tariff tantrum, again, and I'm an economical layman, but it seems to me that tariffs, assuming that they would lead to a return of manufacturing to America, That would mean that either American workers will have to be paid more than Chinese workers, for instance, produce these things perhaps more efficiently than in China, but not that much more efficiently, so they will cost more, or machines will do their work, which means that the people who might want to buy those things cannot afford them because they're not the ones who are getting paid. So, yes, manufacture might come back to the United States, but not to the benefit of anybody living there apart from the owners of the factories. But you spoke about re-embedding those markets, and that seems to me a terribly important question because we live in the world we live in, and there is no going back in history, and there is no starting with an ideal situation. And I always get bored with utopias that assume that everybody has goodwill and insight. Capitalism does have the charm of making people with antagonistic interests work together and achieve a meaningful outcome through making a contract. When you talk about re-embedding the markets in society, what would that look like, and what political choices would that require?
Well, that is the big question, and frankly, as much as I am very glad that we have Polanyi to give us a common language to speak across fields and disciplines, I think that there isn't a rigorous consensus understanding of what the process of re-embedding actually means. It's something that I think we like to use as a heuristic device, but I'm not sure that we're ever talking about the same things.
But I mean, we are living in a world of disembedding, or to use the old Marxist term, alienation. I mean, through our lives in the digital sphere, through our work away from other people, I mean, through the markets we draw our stuff from or work into, which are far beyond our ken. We're living in a very disembedded world. So this is totally going against the cultural trend.
Right. Well, and so how does one do that? How does one imagine a different future than the one that seems to be constructed or is in the process of being constructed in front of us?
Go ahead, imagine.
That's what I'm going to do. Or rather, I'm going to make a pitch for how I think I try to approach doing this and how I maybe think other people should as well, because it's going to take more than just one person to do the imagining, which is that I actually think this is where history is useful, or perhaps most useful. And what I mean by that is that I think if you were to ask most people what is the point of learning history, they would probably say something like, you learn lessons from the past, don't repeat the mistakes, right? Well, almost no historian actually thinks that. Most historians think the past is entirely different, the context is different, people face different constraints, everything was different. There aren't lessons that are trans-historical, that instead what we see is what is unusual or unprecedented about our current moment. Well, so then what's the point? What is history good for? Well, I think what history is good for is realizing that whatever is the case in the world today is not permanent, natural, and inevitable, but rather was created by people. And that when we see that something has a history, we see that there was a moment when it was created. And that implies that there's a moment where it will end. And if we realize, which we do when we learn history, that the world used to be different, I think that allows us more imaginative space to think about how it might be different again. And I think it gives us a sense of kind of humility to realize that there are many instances in the past where some sort of radical change seemed impossible, and then it happened, after which it seemed to have been inevitable.
By the way, the abolition of slavery you talked about earlier.
Precisely. The French Revolution, all sorts of things didn't seem thinkable, but then they happened. And then we say, well, now, of course, it seems obvious that that was going to happen. And so, in that sense, I think trying to denaturalize the claims to the inevitability or the rootedness in human nature of ruthless capitalist competition and production is itself a valuable thing to keep alive. To recognize that, in fact, capitalism has a history, that the cultural predilections of us to participate in capitalism have a history.
By the way, sort of just picking up on that, but one of the benefits of doing history for me is, for instance, to see that when Darwin formulated his idea of evolution and of the survival of the fittest and in the competition red in tooth and claw, it was the high time of Manchester capitalism. And this is a biological metaphor for Manchester capitalist society. Count Kropotkin, or Prince Kropotkin, who also wrote a history of evolution at the same time and built on symbiosis and cooperation, could explain just as well how evolution might have happened. But, I mean, social metaphors become scientific truths. And doing history, you can see that. You can see how these things are generated, how you can see how they correspond.
Well, or to take another example, somewhere between John Stuart Mill in the 1860s and the marginalists in the 1870s, we move from a world in which we assume that economic life and wealth and capital and output are physical, tangible things that we can touch in the world, to thinking about them as imaginary things to do with value and satisfaction and utility and satisfying consumer aspirations, at which point they become potentially infinite. Well, and so that means that the capacity to accumulate and of individuals to accumulate capital becomes potentially infinite. And so when I argue with the defenders of somebody like an Elon Musk, what they say is that he deserves all of his money because he has produced so much happiness and satisfaction for so many people. I don't know any of those people, but so I'm told.
Let's assume they exist.
Right. Well, so satisfaction and happiness is a potentially infinite thing that you can be potentially infinitely rewarded for, in a way that in 1867 somebody would have said, well, no, there's just, you make a number of physical objects in the world and that's it. That's what the economy is. Well, and so that kind of shift from the finite to the infinite, the tangible to the intangible, clearly structures our understanding of growth and the possibility of the survival of the economic system even now, without us realizing that is itself a precondition that has a history that we can trace. Well, so that's my pitch is essentially that history, far from being a set of lessons, is a radical, emancipatory, imaginative act of denaturalizing the world around us, and in doing so, hopefully, opening up a wider horizon of thinkable alternative futures, because we realize that there was a much wider set of pasts that we've forgotten or have been lost, or we haven't told the history of. And so, that's my way of trying to resolve the classic question from Frederick Jameson: why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism? Well, so there needs to be some sort of potentially utopian imagination. And I think there's historical grounding for that.
At the moment, in this particular moment, and I mean, this is a podcast about turning points in history, and we happen to be living at the biggest one, I think with the climate crisis, probably humanity has ever, and AI has ever faced, but I mean, certainly that our political order has ever faced. In this enormous moment of change, we can imagine a dozen terrible futures. We can imagine countries sliding into autocracy. We can imagine an American fascism. We can imagine Europe being reduced to a series of colonies of hostile states. I mean, there's a lot of fun to be had in imagining disastrous outcomes. But your idea, your, as you say, unachieved idea of embedding markets, give us an idea of a possible future that is actually desirable and that can actually happen in this world.
I think that any credible story about that would have to begin with the hope or the belief that there's going to be some sort of large-scale popular reaction against our current political moment, which I think is very likely. And I think it's very likely in part because I think the oligarch class has not realized that, in fact, it depends on the state to organize the anarchy of capitalist production. And so, I don't know that I have a happy story that doesn't run through successful democratic resistance. That is hard to imagine ending well for anybody. But I think it is possible that there's a large-scale political landslide against this this particular oppressive class of people.
But what we're noticing at the moment is an erosion of positive attitudes to democracy, is a rising pessimism that people have for the futures, when 70% in the United States thinks that their kids will have it worse than they had did, which is the great reversal of the post-war years. So, I mean, how is it possible to reinvest people sufficiently in democracies to do that? Is AOC and Bernie Sanders, are they enough?
Well, at the moment, they're the only thing we have.
They're the only show in town.
They are the only show in town, and they are attracting a lot of people. And I think it, there's a story that I can tell myself that everything will change with just one successful moment of resistance. One win could be a tipping point. But all of that is dependent on the idea that there will be future elections and that democracy will continue to exist.
But this is not just an American story. Here in Europe, we see the same disaffection with democracy, the same move of political power to the extremes, the same change in people's attitudes, the same readiness for radical disruption and system change. So this is not just an American story, and it will take more than one political movement to reinvest people, if that is indeed possible, in this idea of democracy, or to find that the digital technologies that now have taken control of our societies are in fact not compatible with democratic decision makings, because they isolate people in opinion bubbles. They give people different facts, which is really not very handy if you want to have collective decisions about what to do. So perhaps these technologies actually forestall any chance of rebuilding a successful democracy.
I mean, that is very plausible. And it's also true, though, that every technology has a hype cycle, and every technology has, an expiration date, and we don't know which ones will follow. I think, that to interest people in democracy, it has to be clear that they have something to gain, that democracy offers them something. And that for that reason, there need to be elites for them to vote for who are willing to offer them something.
But what if these elites are delinquent in their duty?
That does continue to be the problem. And so I wasn't entirely being facetious about Bernie Sanders and AOC, that what distinguishes them is that they do actually want to offer people something, which the rest of the Democratic Party has been singularly unwilling to do for decades. And so it might be that the long road to renewal, as Stuart Hall would have said, begins with some sort of takeover or recomposition, or perhaps the wholesale destruction of the kind of center-left collaborationist parties that have failed to live up to their historic task of being some sort of resistance. And that I think there is now appetite for that anyone who is brave enough to try to take on that task, I think, will receive support. Will they succeed? I don't know. But, the difficult thing about, any of these claims of what the political system of the future might look like is, as much as I want to think about that I have a strong understanding of how we got here, we have to always have, what again Stuart Hall would have called a kind of a politics without guarantees. If I'm trying to think that there is a wider range of possibilities of the future, that also means a wider range of different failure scenarios for, what my own hopes might be. I should say that I'm among the gloomier of my colleagues in the history world. And, usually I'm the one asking the questions that you're asking. And for that reason, I wish I had better answers.
Well, no, but I do think they're very important questions. And I mean, the future of a possibility of democracy in our societies, I mean, I've been talking quite often on this podcast about what I call the crisis of the liberal project, a project that goes back to the Enlightenment, but we might be seeing the end of it, which is something that I would have vehemently denied 10 years ago. But this idea of equality, of human rights, of democracy, we thought it to be universal. It may not be as universal as we thought, and it may indeed be, associated to one kind of society. So this is why I highly value your questions, and I mean, interesting questions are always better than boring answers.
Indeed.
Listen, thank you very much for giving me your time and giving us all your time. There's a lot of engaged listeners in this podcast. It would be an absolute privilege to have you back at some point, because I think these conversations and these probing questions from you and these questionings of the framing of our debate, they are so important at the moment that, well, thank you for your essayistic work, and I'm looking forward to reading more from you, and well, I hope I'll see you soon again.
I'd love that. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. That was Trevor Jackson talking to me about, capitalism and history and capitalism and democracy. This was another episode of the BlomCast. Stay with me. Come along for the next episode and tell people about this fantastic podcast. Thank you and goodbye.